My name is Emmanuel Wachendo. I'm a program officer here. The most effective signals for the growing demand for the East Africa community, a regional economic community, have been the ascension of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the accession of Somalia, and the fact that Ethiopia too has shown interest in joining the East African community. Now, Sudan, which is currently at war, has also expressed interest multiple times. I think most recently, its interest was blocked by countries like Uganda that felt like Sudan, for sensitive political reasons, should not belong to the EAC at this point. Now, what were these reasons? The reasons that the conflicts between Sudan and what is now South Sudan had an ethnic and racial character to them, So Uganda said, no, we do not want to admit Sudan to the East African community because of what those ethnic and racial undertones, right? That the North had based some of its aggression on the South on racial and ethnic lines. So, in closing, there is interest for the East African community, interest enough for someone to make a fake account, and interest enough for you to see proliferation of different expressions of what's going on. You know, people ask the questions, what's going on with the EAC? They're questioning its aspirations for political and economic integration. Where is the EAC today? If we look at just the export value, right? In total export value, this is US dollars in billions. So we could see that in total, in 2022, the exports of the East African community were valued at just around $65 billion. Right now, this is a factor change between 2017 and 2022. It rose by 3.86 times, but some of that can actually be attributed to the joining of the Democratic Republic of Congo to the EAC, right? So DRC took up almost 45% of the East African community's exports. The next most important exporters were Kenya, now Tanzania. This chapter is called The Emblems of Health of the EAC. Now, it's so termed because this chapter's focus is trying to understand what are some important elements that we should carry with us as we continue to think about where the EAC is going. Now, in terms of trade, we need to understand the revealed comparative advantage. We need to come out with an understanding of where the region's economic complexity is. And then this in addition to trends in general volume and value of trade. Now, why are these three important? Because in order for the East Africa community, for each nation to deliver on the aspirations of improved economic welfare, aspirations that are enshrined in the East Africa Community Charter, well, they're going to have to improve the economic complexity of the product produced. These countries will have to improve their linkages to global trade. Now, this list here does not include the Democratic Republic of Congo or Somalia for two reasons. The first one is I thought that these countries would say something about where at least the state of health is, and we can look at DRC after that. But the other reason was that the visualization, actually the data source, did not recognize the Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda as members of the East Africa community. So the judgment in selecting this data set was based on just looking at the economic complexity and looking at some other important undercurrents. Now, here you have the trends, imports and exports. So you can see that Kenya, although Kenya has been taking the most important share of exports, actually Tanzanian exports share of the total East African export trade with the world has been growing. Here we see that most of the East African community's exports have been characterized by exports in raw materials and exports in agricultural products. Gold, most of the gold exported in East Africa actually comes from Tanzania and then a little bit from Burundi and Rwanda. Internally, cereals, the trade in cereals dominated the internal trade. Now, of course, again, this excludes Uganda, but we will look at Uganda in the chapter that follows. Export destinations in the year 2022, actually, India between 2017 and 2022 grew to be the most important export partner for the East African community, right? In that 5-year period, exports to India actually grew by 137%. In total, in terms of geographic regions, Asia has actually become a more important trade partner for the East African community than Europe. But here we also see that Africa is also an important trade partner for the East African community, starting, of course, with the countries within the East African community itself. Trade with the European Union has been driven by Kenyan exports of flowers to the Netherlands. Italy and Spain have also grown in their importance of trade with the East African community, but trade with Europe has been dominated mainly with Kenya's trade with the Netherlands. But one important point here is that it seems that Asia, first of all, Asia has grown to be the most important trade partner for the East African community. On the left, we see here a chart of the East African community's trade relations with the world in 1995. And then here we see where those trade relations were in the year 2022. And here we see that now this is actually import relations, right? China was a very important import trade partner for the East African community. So could this be an Asian century for the East African community? Could there be more looking east? From an economic perspective, trade with Kenya's and East Africa's trade with Asia is actually driven by one important factor is the import of petroleum products from the Middle East, but also the import of low-cost consumer goods and machines from Asia, right? So Asia, especially China and India, offer, for example, motorbikes that are cheaper than what could be imported from the United States, consumer electronics, your microwaves. There's the reason that many Kenyans today can own a flat screen television with very, very respectable visuals is because of the productivity of Asia, China's the fact that China produces low-cost products, that China's growing labor productivity, but also the fact that when you compare the cost of Chinese labor to the cost of European or American labor, Chinese labor can produce a kind of products that Africans can afford to consume, right? So this means that economically, the East African community is looking east in a way. Now, here we have the economic complexity and per capita incomes. And you can see here that Kenya and Tanzania have the most important manufacturing base in the East African community. In the year 2022, Tanzania made exports of $10 billion, while Kenya made exports of $7.34 billion. This, according to the Observatory Economic Complexity. What is significant about the picture we're looking at here is this, the Economic Complexity Index. Kenya has a very slight edge on economic complexity relative to Tanzania. So the economic complexity value is stronger, the more positive it is, right? So Kenya's per capita, about $2.1 thousand. Tanzania's per capita, $1.19 thousand. And you can see the economic complexity. But what this chart is saying is trying to show what difference economic complexity can make in per capita incomes, right? That in order for Tanzania to get to where Kenya is, now again, these are relative dwarfs competing with each other. So it's not that there is so much to be proud of, really, but that still Tanzania will have to see its economic complexity grow. It's possible, for example, let's say in a world where Tanzania discovered some, vast reserves of petroleum and started exporting them. Yeah, perhaps per capita incomes could rise, but improving labor productivity remains an important foundation to improving incomes. So if Tanzania does not do that, you can look at Nigeria as an example, or Venezuela. As soon as that oil runs out, you could have important problems. All that is to say this: Tanzanian export of raw materials have been growing. You have your gold, have some gas that has been discovered, copper, but it's the East Africa community is going to have to continue to improve labor productivity. To three, Kenyan relations within the East African community. Now, when you include all the nations that are in actual fact members of the East African community, we find that the most traded product in the East African community is actually cement. Here, and this is a trade between Kenya and Uganda. So Kenyan exports of cement to Uganda are so in total, Kenya's exports to Uganda are valued at $831 million. That's for the year 2021. And in that year, 11% of these exports were made in cement. The second most important product was palm oil, a close second, right? And then coated flat iron, flat rolled iron. Now, what does this mean when we look at Kenya's trade relations with Uganda? You can see comparative advantage. Kenya having that comparative advantage in production in cement. But if we look into it a bit deeper, we can see that still, let's say you consider the cost of constructing a house, right? And that in the construction of a house, if you take Kenya's 14 million households, durability of the walls of a house are determined by the availability of stone and cement. So if the fact that the trade in cement is not open in Kenya means that perhaps consumer choice for Kenyans is being constrained, right? So what would happen if Kenya's trade in cement was a bit more open? Maybe Uganda, Kenyans in the first place would, Kenyan cement manufacturers might have to compete more with external competitors. That's something to explore. What would be the meaning of that? But perhaps this could also change the effect, at least for me as I stand here, the potential effect of this on Kenya's trade with Uganda and cement. What would it be? Maybe this is explained first by Kenya's manufacturing base, right? Kenya has a bigger manufacturing base than does Uganda. Kenya also has geographic proximity to Uganda. So starting with those two factors can explain this trade, that Uganda is finding it cost effective to get imports of cement from Kenya. If we go on, Kenya's trade with Somalia is dominated by exports in tobacco and then imports in prefabricated buildings, which is interesting. 40% of Kenyan imports from Somalia are made in prefabricated buildings. Kenya's trade with South Sudan. Here again, Kenya exports relatively the processed agricultural product that is alcohol, and imports some special textiles here, the felt or coated fabric garments. There's a sawn wood, which speaks to probably South Sudan's comparative advantage in wood. And as you go on and scan Kenya's trade relations with the rest of the region, there's processed foods like alcohol and raw materials. Then you have other elements that represent Kenya's manufacturing base, right? Cement, rolled iron, processed metals. In all, Kenya's trade with the region is based on Kenya's comparative advantage in port access to the ocean, right? Because you have a lot of landlocked nations, right? Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then Kenya's manufacturing base that offers those processed foods, whether they be sugar or alcohol, whether they be cement or processed metals, and then also petroleum from abroad coming through Kenya to the landlocked countries. Now we close this with a look at a liner shipping connectivity. Now the liner shipping connectivity index examines the connectivity of ports to the world. In the East African region, now we include Djibouti as a nation that is in the region, and Sudan. Actually, Djibouti had the highest connectivity to the world in the whole region. China had the highest connectivity globally with a connectivity index of 175. What determined this level of connectivity? Well, the number of scheduled ship calls, the weight of ships passing through the port, the number of regular shipping lines. So how many ships pass through, come back and forth. A line can be defined by, you have a schedule that this ship comes in, drops goods, maybe picks up more goods and goes back, or maybe goes back partially empty, but it goes back and forth. The size of the largest ship that actually enters the port. And so you can see that the size of a nation's or a nation's GDP does not have a straight line relationship with that nation's connectivity. You can see here that Singapore has a higher liner shipping connectivity index than does the United States. What does this mean for the region? This means that Kenya and Tanzania's performance are actually underwhelming, right? In terms of connectivity to the world. Djibouti has a much better connectivity to the world than do these two countries. Somalia's connectivity, now considering that Somalia has relatively dysfunctional institutions, but the longest coastline on the African continent, the longest coastline belonging to a single country. So you could see that, first of all, geography gives you an important leg up in terms of connectivity. But still, in addition to geography, a country can actually make efforts now there's, of course, there's a public policy side where one of the determinants of connectivity, or one of the factors that attracts the kinds of investments that drive connectivity, is how quickly your ports can turn goods around, how smoothly products can be moved through, how much your port services improve or degrade the amount of trust between the counterparties to seaborne trade. On the whole continent, South Africa has had in the year 2021 the best global connectivity, right? 49th best in the world, best on the continent, and it grew by 7.7% between the years 2021 and 2020. No, 2022 and 2023. In that same period, Ghana's index grew by 1.6%. Nigeria's index grew by 25%, the most important change, and Ivory Coast and Togo grew by 5.2% and 2.2%. What can we see? The West actually had a relative dominance in connectivity in this period of time when West and South Africa actually improved their connectivity. Kenya and Tanzania, let me put it this way. You have a crisis, which we had a chat about last week, a crisis on the Horn, where one group has actually reduced the amount of ships passing through the Bab el Mandeb Strait. Kenya and Tanzania, on a per capita basis, should actually you take the size of their GDP, compare that to the size of their exports, and then their reliability on how much they rely on trade passing through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Kenya and Tanzania should care more about these disruptions than Germany does. But there hasn't been much word about this. So that's just one small signal about how concerned the Kenya and Tanzania are about improving, on the one hand, improving their connectivity to the world, and on the other hand, actually responding to disruptions to their what connectivity they already do enjoy. So in closing, the East the East African community, what is the state of the East African of trade in the East African community? So many nations want to join the community on the one hand, but on the other hand, you find that institutional dysfunction in terms of, let's say, trade dispute resolution means that in recent years, your cows could be seized or your products could be destroyed because of a misunderstanding between political actors representing two different countries. That is not a positive sign for the future of integration in East Africa. But despite this, we do see that data on migration shows, right? If we take the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, okay, first of all, speaking broadly, there are undercurrents that show that the region, that there is demand for more regional integration. At the very top, you have more requests to join. At the bottom, you have traders and migrants moving within the region. You have migrants moving from unstable regions in their own nations and trying to move east into East Africa, into countries like Tanzania or Kenya or Uganda. You have traders that exploit Kenya's ports to import cheaper and accessible textiles, both secondhand and manufactured abroad in places like China, importing things like shoes into places like Uganda. And then you have a regional trade that is dominated by exports to the world in raw materials and exports in manufactured goods that have not undergone significant levels of transformation. Then you have a region that is not as connected to the world as other nations on the continent itself, right? A region whose major ports have lower connectivity than the port of the smaller country of Djibouti. These are all calls for humility in policy analysis, in the kinds of conclusions that we make about where the region is, but also in the distance between ambitions and reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel, for that insightful discussion. I'll just sort of give a summary of what he's explained. First, he started with explaining that there's demand for the EAC by looking at the admission of DRC into the East African community and also the factors around the admission of Somalia into the East African community. Then he also looked at the exports, the different he compared the exports of the East African community and Somalia. Then the next chapter was on the emblems of the health of the EAC trade. And in this, he mentioned that sort of recommended the need to improve economic complexity of their products. This is the EAC countries to increase their linkages to global trade. And going through the charts in chapter 2 on the emblems of the health of EAC trade, he looked at the export growth, and there was a major distinction between two countries, that is Kenya and Tanzania. And Kenya occupied a large share of exports, while Tanzania's exports have been growing. And then the export growth of different products, and one that stood out was gold. in Tanzania as a major export from Tanzania. Then there was the EAC export destinations, and we've seen an emergence of an export destination to Asian countries, majorly India, which has been highlighted in one of the slides, and exports to India has grown by 137% over the years. And next, he looked at exports to Asia, Europe, and also African countries. Then next, he looked at the destinations growth in European destinations. And after that, he highlighted that Asia has become a great trade partner to the EAC, asking whether it's an Asian century for the EAC imports. Then in the next slide, he looked at the economic complexity and per capita incomes, comparing Kenya and Tanzania. And he highlighted that improving labor productivity is an important foundation to improving incomes. Then the next chapter was on Kenyan relations within the EAC, of which he highlighted the economic point of comparative advantage in some products between the different TSE countries in terms of their exports. Most of the countries exported products in which they had a comparative advantage over the other ESC countries as they traded within ESC, Africa, Asia, and Europe. Then the final chapter was on liner shipping connectivity, which he explained as a country's integration level to global liner, that is how connected a port is to the world. And he looked at it in terms of the liner shipping connectivity index. And from the index, he mentioned that regionally, Djibouti has been performing well, and globally it's China, Djibouti with 34.8, and China with 175.73, ranking on the liner shipping connectivity index. And also, he explained it as how quickly can ports turn products around. Yes, I'd like to welcome the plenary session. Please raise your hand if you have a question or type in the chat box. And yeah, let's make it as interactive as possible. Thank you. Rachel, do you have a question? Yeah, please unmute your mic, and yeah, you can switch on your camera and ask your questions or type it in the chat. I'm just checking. I hope you're able to see the screen by now. Yes, Anne, I can see your hand raised. Okay, yeah, you are confirming you're able to see the screen. Thank you. Anyone else with a question or comment? Okay, looks like there's no question. I'd like to request the presenter to give his final comments and conclusion to the webinar.
So the most traded product in the East African community in the year 2021 was cement, and that was a product traded between Kenya and Uganda. Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo are the most important exporters in the East African community. The most important exporters in the East African community have their exports dominated by raw materials and agriculture, right? Mainly metals, and some petroleum products and agricultural products like tea. Some of these countries like Kenya and Tanzania, their top exports actually give them a relatively significant revealed comparative advantages. So for Kenya's revealed comparative advantage for tea is beyond 500. So which is to say that Kenya exports 500 times more tea than a nation. I mean, relative to the size of its exports, its total exports. So these are portents of a region whose complexity is growing, but at a very pitiable rate. This means that the prospects for improved labor productivity remain low in the coming years. And this in decades that are shaping up to be fraught with more both geopolitical tensions and tensions in climate change. These nations' connectivity to the world, in terms of as can be measured by indices like liner shipping, are not improved, are relatively low when compared even just to smaller nations on the continent and other players on the continent. The nation has no geographic excuse to have such low connectivity to the world. East Africa has some ways to go in terms of making the kinds of policy investments that would improve its connectivity to global value chains and that would improve labor productivity. There's quite a lot of work to do. Many people want to join, but it's not a club of the strongest or most admirable players. Thank you very much for joining our webinar. We will continue to follow East African community issues, and we'll be starting a Grand Prix, a competition of quizzes. The most important participants, right? Those who participate, the most intense participants in these quizzes, in this competition, will get to join us with our program advisory committee and other panelists in a roundtable discussion on the state of the East African community when we do complete and launch our report in the third quarter. Thank you very much for joining and have a good day.
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel. As we close, I'd like to thank everyone, the presenter and also the attendees to this webinar. Thank you, Emmanuel, for your contribution and for the presentation, and everyone for staying with us all through the webinar. The IEA is a member organization, and if you would like to be a member, please send an email to our communication department. We have Oscar and Michelle. They'll be able to help you through the process. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this webinar. I hope you have a good day. Thank you. Bye.